Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this EPC Hybrid Policy Dialogue in cooperation with the Istituto Affari Internazionali. You may be surprised to see me moderating this event because it was supposed to be my colleague Mihai, who is our expert on disinformation. Unfortunately, he has fallen ill, so I have had to step in. So welcome again. The topic of today's conversation is disinformation ahead of the EU parliamentary elections, a snapshot from Bulgaria, Germany, and Italy. The actual meeting today is based on a new publication, a new EPC discussion paper by one of the speakers here today, from Federica Marconi, who is a researcher at the IAI in Rome. This paper is also part of the work of the EPC's Disinformation Task Force, which is a cross-cutting program in our organization that was established several months ago. Now, the paper dives quite deeply into disinformation against the backdrop of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the trends ahead of the European Parliament elections. It looks, as I mentioned earlier, at Bulgaria, Germany, and Italy as case studies, and it highlights the nuances of disinformation surrounding three issues, namely refugees, military support for Ukraine, and energy-related topics. It sort of sheds light on the potential impact on public sentiment and electoral dynamics. It also highlights national and EU efforts to counter disinformation and what more must be done to increase resilience against disinformation and safeguard the integrity of the forthcoming parliament elections. I guess as everybody in this room knows, especially those of us who've worked on Russia for a long time, Russia has a long history of disinformation, but of undermining elections. I mean, not just in Europe, but elsewhere, including in the US, as I'm sure we will remember from the previous US presidential elections, but more broadly spreading disinformation as well as its massive propaganda. And to do this, it uses multiple tools and multiple actors to do its work, both in Russia, but outside Russia, which enable it to spread this disinformation. And while I would say that well, the EU and the West in general, the democratic world even, has countered Russian disinformation, at the same time, the Kremlin continues to adapt and evolve its policies and the tools that it uses, particularly in this new era of artificial intelligence, which continues to actually grow. I mean, for example, deep fakes, doctored videos, harmful content nowadays travel across the internet really, really quickly. And the use of technology leads to social polarization, which is a increasing concern. I mean, sometimes to me, it sounds like we're playing this game, which you may know, whack-a-mole, if you know that. While a big effort is made to crack down on disinformation, new ideas and steps and, very cunning plans come to actually reinforce what's going on. And I mean, the Russian government, for example, is recently financing an ongoing campaign across the whole of Latin America, which has become a sort of the new market, if I can put it that way, basically through different news sources. So there's plenty to do in Europe, but there's plenty to do elsewhere. But I mean, the main focus of today's meeting, as I said, is the European Parliament election. So I won't divert away from that, which is sometimes my issue. So to kick off, we're going to have some opening remarks from the president of IAI. Then Federica is going to present the paper, and then we will go on to our very excellent and knowledgeable panel, who I'm going to briefly introduce now. So first of all, on my right, Mattia Caniglia, I hope that's probably a very bad pronunciation, who is an associate director at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, where he coordinates training and capacity building activities on open source intelligent techniques, disinformation, and digital resilience, among probably many other things. Alice Stollmeyer, to my far left, is very well known in this town, and who is the founder and executive director of Defend Democracy. She has a background in social studies of science, technology, and society, and is a former digital strategist. Alice now works on democracy, technology, geopolitics, and hybrid threats. And last but not least, our speaker online today, Margot Fulde-Hardy, who is a researcher and consultant on electoral interference and disinformation. So welcome to all of you here today. I'm looking forward to having a good conversation with you all. But I turn the floor now, first of all, to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Ferdinando Nelli Feroci. I'm the president of the Istituto Affari Internazionali. I'm not an expert on disinformation, this I need to stress, but I'm very pleased and honored to be here today to open the proceedings of this meeting. And I'm grateful to EPC for hosting the meeting, but also for coordinating the project European Dialogue on Disinformation ahead of the European elections 2024, a program which is funded by the European Commission. I think it's good to be reminded. Today, we will examine the various implications of the use of fake news and disinformation campaigns and their impact on the next elections of the European Parliament in June next year. The study that we will discuss will be presented by Federica Marconi. She's also the author of the study, and I wish to thank her very much for this work that she's done, a very good piece of paper. And it's a paper which has already been anticipated, which should look at the situation of disinformation campaigns in three individual countries of the European Union, which are Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria, and with a particular focus or reference to three different issues that have already been mentioned that I would like to remind briefly. The first one has to do with the presence of Ukrainian refugees in our countries, and in particular in the three countries that have been examined, but also more general, the question of the reactions of local communities towards the presence of migrants and foreigners in their countries. The second one is the question of the war in Ukraine and of its origin, causes, and responsibilities. And the third one has to do with another very hot issue, is the question of energy transition and the related costs and benefits of energy transition. In the paper that will be presented, you will find, if you have the patience of reading it, as I hope, you will find a number of cases of disinformation campaigns which are quoted in the three countries and on the three subjects. You will see that there is an evidence of the impact of these campaigns on national public opinion and orientation of electors. And must be said that, as it has been mentioned again once more, most of these campaigns has been conducted by Russian sources, but Russian sources are not the only sources. There are other countries that are practicing this disinformation activities quite evidently, but there are also private or privately funded an organization that use this information campaign. I think that this discussion we're having today and the project is very timely because we are heading towards elections of the European Parliament in June next year, and in most European countries, the electoral campaign has practically already started. And we have seen, in particular in my country, the political debate is quite heated already. The intensity of the debate, of course, will increase the more we proceed towards the deadline of next June. And the more we proceed in the debate, which is an electoral debate, the higher the risk of disinformation campaign. This, I think, why it need to be very vigilant, why we need to be aware of the risks that these disinformation campaigns can cause to the well-functioning of our democracies. If I may, if I look briefly at what are possibly the hottest topic in the electoral campaign next year, at least from a country like mine, I would say that certainly there will be a confrontation within those that advocate more Europe and those that stress the need to give back to the nation state more competence and responsibilities. Is an old dialectic which I've seen in the past, and it reproduced itself on this campaign. But there are a few items, I think, which will be at the center of the campaign. I see the first one, all the measures that have to do with growth, which need to be sustainable and inclusive, but also competitiveness, and measures that can be adopted at the EU level in order to foster growth and competitiveness. Of course, climate change, energy transition, and the related cost of energy transition. A lot I see also on the question of management of migratory flows. And a few more items could be probably costs and benefits of digital technologies and artificial intelligence, and how to regulate artificial intelligence, and the role of the European Union in the world, and in particular the position that the European Union should take towards some particularly important stakeholders, like for instance the US, Russia, or China. Well, what I think that on all these issues, since they are very sensitive politically in all these countries of Europe, and of course in the three that have been examined, there is a high risk of disinformation campaigns that can be operated both by foreign countries, but also by local constituencies and interests concerned. So I think that there is a need to know more about this phenomenon. There is a need to develop fact-checking initiatives. There is a need to go on with public denunciations of fake news, and with a more widespread commitment by public authorities, both at national level and at the European level. Some legislative initiatives have already been adopted by the European Union. We see in the paper a reference to the Digital Service Act, the Artificial Intelligence Act, which has been more or less agreed a few days ago, is another instrument that can help counter and contrast this information, but there is more that can be done. And let me conclude by observing that I very much hope that this conference and the project more generally will help increase awareness of the dangers and risks of disinformation and the use of fake news. And also let me express the wish that from this conference and from the project, policy recommendations may emerge. It can be addressed to both national and European authorities that can help them to develop measures that could contain the risk of disinformation campaigns. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. President. I forgot to mention it earlier, but the report will be available outside. My colleagues are currently printing it up, so please don't forget to grab a copy when you leave for bedtime reading or weekend reading, whichever you prefer. But without further ado, I'll give the floor to you, Federica, so you can present your excellent paper.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction and also for having us here and hosting this whole event. The paper I'm going to briefly present is, as already mentioned, the result of a research we have carried out in the past few months. And the aim is to provide a snapshot of disinformation trends ahead of the election in 2024, focusing on these three countries, Bulgaria, Germany, and Italy. The topic is of particular importance, but it's also nothing new, I would say, because we can just think about the fact that already in 2016, the European Parliament mentioned and warned on the risks stemming from disinformation, especially in terms of increasing systemic pressure on societies and their electoral stability. But we can also say that while these fears related to disinformation have not materialized as expected in the previous elections in 2019, this year things could be slightly different, especially considering that the scenario where the elections are taking place has changed so much during the last years, not just because of major geopolitical events, COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, but also considering how fast is the development in the technological and digital field. As we said, the main focus of this paper is on disinformation coming from Russia, although we know that the phenomenon is wider and more complex than this and involves a wide range of actors using and also relying on different tools. But here, what we really wanted to do in this paper was to give an overview of the most common narratives in each country by providing examples of fake news. And in doing so, we actually had a round of interviews for our background research. And then we tried to review all the most relevant documents and reports, especially from fact-checking organizations that have been released in I would say the second half of 2023. Regarding the country, I just want to give you some information about also the methodology. We decided to focus on these three countries because we wanted to have a geographical coverage of countries within the European Union that have very different backgrounds for political, but also historical and cultural reasons. Actually, to try to understand also how this information manifests itself within this different context, and also how this information can adapt to different national contexts and peculiarities. As far the topics are concerned, as already mentioned, there are three main topics, which are displacement of refugees, energy crisis, and Western military support for Ukraine. And also here we decided to focus especially on this because we thought that there are all sensitive topics, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine, that may have a strong grip on the sentiment of European Union citizens, but can also be used and exploited somehow by electoral campaigns ahead of the elections. So looking at the first topic, the one of refugees, for example, what we the main narratives we identified, especially at the very beginning of the war, were those trying to depict Ukrainian refugees as violent and dangerous, especially when they started to move from Ukraine to safer countries within the European Union. But as the war draws on, we can also see that they started to be depicted as receiving more social benefits from governments than citizens from the hosting countries, and in particular in terms of pensions, but also car insurance, or child and parental benefits, housing benefits. While a third narrative that it's somehow, I would say, also broader than this, more general, is the one that tries to that refers to the number of refugees. So there are fake information about the number of refugees that are actually in the countries. And in this case, this kind of narrative, it also tries to instill the fear of invasion and falsely representing countries as overwhelmed by refugees. So when it comes to this topic, we can say that disinformation and these narratives of disinformation can contribute to create also fertile ground for hostile sentiments that can result in an erosion of the overall support for refugees, so even beyond Ukrainians refugees, but can also be exploited ahead of the elections by parties that are actually trying to promote anti-immigration agendas. If we look at the second topic, so the one of Western military support for Ukraine, one of the most common narrative is the one focusing on, at least trying to shift the blame and the responsibilities for the war in Ukraine. At the very beginning, it was more focused on trying to depict Ukrainians are Nazi, and also trying to present the war itself as something needed to denazify Ukraine. But now, as the war is still ongoing, we can see that, for example, the main narratives are trying to depict Ukrainians as unreliable partners. And in this light, just to give you examples, we can we can mention the attempt to spread false information, presenting them as committing war crimes, using weapons supplied by the West, but also violating international norms. Another narrative quite common, especially in Bulgaria, for example, is the one of the military assistance to Ukraine, presented as something that is damaging the national interest of the country, providing this kind of help. Also in this case, so relating to this topic, I mean, of course, sentiments around the war are not shaped only by disinformation, but of course it can contribute to create confusion, but also anxieties that can then result in an erosion of support for Ukraine. And this is even more important if we think that Ukraine is now an EU candidate, so it's deeply involved also in the discussion regarding the process of enlargement of the European Union. Regarding the third topic, so the energy crisis, we decided to focus also on that, especially considering that all the three countries we selected were heavily reliant on Russia's energy supply when the war started. And also this kind of narratives, so energy-related narratives, were quite common before the war, but then they have been adapted to this new context, especially trying to exploit also the fear surrounding then the energy crisis. Most common narrative, just to mention a few of them, are, for example, the one of the lack of viable alternatives to meet the European Union's need in terms of energy needs, but also presenting the support for Ukraine as the main or even the only cause for the skyrocketing energy prices. This topic is important looking at the elections, also considering that polls from previous elections in 2019 showed that actually the topic of climate change, green transition, and energy concerns more in a more broader way, were one of the most relevant topic in shaping voters' preferences in 2019. To conclude very briefly, what we can say in this report, so the result of this study is that all these three countries actually show very similar vulnerabilities when it comes to disinformation, with common patterns and also trends that actually underscore the relevance of the challenges that disinformation poses to democracy. Many initiatives has been taken, as also mentioned before, not just at the national level, but also the European one. So we can say that at the national level, there is a progress in fighting disinformation. Nevertheless, these initiatives may fall short in addressing the risks ahead of the election, considering that also many measures are very recent and the election are coming next year. So there is also little time for implementing it. If we look at the European Union level, the role of the EU is fundamental in terms both of monitoring. Just to give an example, we can think also of the EDMO task force on the European Union parliamentary elections, and especially in terms of developing legal tools against disinformation. As mentioned, the Digital Services Act, but also the Artificial Intelligence Act provide measures that can help in fighting against disinformation. So to wrap up, actually, we can say that positive steps have been taken toward a comprehensive strategy beyond national focused approaches, but there are still maybe limits that need to be addressed, and not just ahead of the election, but also considering the risk for the democratic process in a broader way.
Thank you, Federica, for this, I think, very overarching presentation where you managed to capture a lot of information in quite a short period of time. But I think it might be interesting for the audience if you can briefly sort of explain I mean, how you carried out the research. I mean, how did you get to these findings? And maybe I can also ask you, I mean, in terms of the battle, because you have a battle of narratives. I mean, if you can say something, I mean, at least from your research, on the other narrative. I mean, particularly because we're talking about political parties here in the different countries. I mean, are they doing enough actually to push back on the very strong disinformation narratives that are coming out from other parties, if I can put it that way?
So regarding the way we carried out the research, we had the first round of interviews with national experts from different fields, especially fact checkers. And that helped us to develop like a background research, so also to understand how to make the next steps of the research and which were the most relevant. Also, to have an idea of the most relevant topics, also in the light of picking the right topics. And then we conduct the research with looking at reports that have been published. So collecting basically all the material on disinformation and fake news especially, so to have also concrete examples of what is happening, what are the most common narratives, and also how can they impact also the feelings of the society and citizens, trying to understand how this can result in a risk ahead of the elections. To give examples of disinformation narratives, so like fake news more than narratives themselves, moving from Bulgaria, which I think that was a really interesting case study. For example, at the very beginning, most of the narratives trying to depict Ukrainians are rich and spoiled, just trying to exploit the hosting country. And this narrative especially was one of the most effective ones, also talking to people coming from Bulgaria, because they try to also compare the position of Ukrainians with the one of Bulgarian people, considering that also the standards and living conditions of Bulgaria are among the lowest in Europe. And for example, that was an argument that really had a grip on the population. While in Germany was more focused, especially now, more recent times, on the social benefits. For example, there was a news spreading online of Ukrainians having pensions before Germans or without even contributing by paying taxes to Germany. Or also another one regarding a car accident. And this fake news spreading, actually the content of that was that the insurance would have paid for the Ukrainian guy that caused the accident, and then it would have been refunded by the German state. And also here, there is this contrast between the position of Ukrainians and Germans that may feel with a different treatment by the state itself.
Very much. I have to say, for me, the reference to the Ottoman Empire in the part on Bulgaria was quite interesting. I mean, 100 years since the Ottoman Empire left the country, it's sort of still that sort of picture of the Ottomans and the Russian defenders is still alive and kicking. So I found that quite interesting. So thank you for the presentation. I'd now like to move on to you, Mattia, to hear your thoughts on the report, your main takeaway from the report, but also because you focus a lot on the evolving disinformation from both Russia and China, to say how this has been evolving. You know, as we become more creative, they also become more creative in their tools and mechanisms to actually target the audience they're trying to reach.
Absolutely, thank you, Mand, and thank you to the EPC and to EI for having me. It's always a pleasure, and it's also a pleasure to see. I know that the EPC-IAI has produced reports on disinformation, specifically on Chinese approach to disinformation in the past, but it's nice to see that Italian think tanks are finally focusing even more on this issue, because it's badly needed in the context of Italy. I actually read the report, and I participated also in the preliminary phase of the interviews, so it's definitely well written. So my advice to you all would be to grab a copy and read it. Probably not something to read before going to bed, but fair enough. Christmas is coming, so we'll have all some time to spare. Coming to what you were mentioning at the end of your introduction, in this presentation, I'd like to attempt to provide an overview of how the Russian and Chinese disinformation and influence operations are evolving, in an attempt also to understand what to expect in these coming year of elections. Well, actually elections everywhere all at once. And I will draw upon observation made by the DFR lab, particularly in the months starting from the period before the reinvasion of Ukraine, just to give you a time frame. But why do we need to look at how Russian and Chinese approach to disinformation and information manipulation is evolving, especially in this year with all the election coming up? It's in the end, it's all a matter of war of attention, which is the same word that I'm fighting right now, this moment, to get your attention, and that we're all fighting. Because in the world we live in, attention is all you need, and it's what Ukraine needs right now, is what Hamas is looking for right now, is what Israel is looking for right now. But this is not just in the context of conflict, because we live in a hybrid world in which the difference between a situation of conflict and a situation of peace is blurred. It's not there anymore. But we live in a world in which the modern internet enables near costless content creation and mass transmission. And the limiting factor of this system is one, and it's attention. And the result is an attention economy. So this battle for attention is a contest of psychological and algorithmic manipulation fought through competing viral events. As you can imagine, elections are also a viral event. Advertisers, activists, politicians, but also your friends from elementary schools, each seek the same pool of attention, your attention. And so do national militaries and intelligence agencies. But this is not just a war for attention. The war of attention is also a war of attrition. And it's fought every day. It's a war in which keyboards and screens are as powerful as guns and tanks, and where attention can shape the tides of war and peace, but also of local and global dynamics, politics, and geopolitics. Now, having these in mind, let's try to dive into like what has changed recently, and this tied in very well with what the report covers. So the Russian disinformation apparatus is increasingly relying on less extensive but more frequent campaigns. We are no longer witnessing massive disinformation campaigns like with a single objective, like the ones that we saw during the election in 2016. Instead, we see more agile campaigns with different objectives that might sometimes reinforce each other. And these campaigns are often accompanied by cyber attacks. And the cyber attacks in the disinformation campaign, they can serve to amplify the effect of an ongoing campaign or procure material that can be falsified or forged and then be used in another disinformation campaign. Let me give you two examples. The example of the first case, the attacks on energy operators and energy infrastructure in Italy in September 2022, in combination with the spreading of narratives attributed to Russia, saying that Europe would not survive the winter without the Russian gas. Second example, on the second case, the theft of official document from the Polish Ministry of Defense by Russian hackers, which in the first months of the war were then falsified to forge fake documents about an alleged plan for the military occupation of the Lviv region. Another crucial element of the Russian approach is opportunism. Russian disinformation increasingly exploits opportunities provided by the political discourse, public debates, the news cycle, and always on divisive and polarizing topics in a target country. This means that there is no disinformation if there is no opportunity, or better, there is no successful disinformation campaigns if there are no opportunities, which means that in the electoral context, if we are not very careful about the political debate that we structure and that we organize, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for disinformation. But this also means that the Russian disinformation apparatus has enhanced its ability to orchestrate tailor-made operation adapted to different national contexts. And let me give you an example of these two. While in Italy, around April 2022, a Russian disinfo operation focused on parliamentary voting for sending weapons to Ukraine, and in the case of Italy, was very much about sending weapons altogether. There was not so much tailoring. There was a vote happening in the months before the vote happening in the parliament, disinformation campaign on this topic. But in France, same timing, the political discourse around that voting is much more about, and you might remember this, around the Caesar cannon. These incredibly powerful French weapons that the French were about to deliver to them. And so the disinformation campaigns actually plays on that specific issue. Why? Because that name is trending on France, Twitter, and so on and so forth. We also have observed that Russian disinformation operations are now characterized by a multi-layered and multi-step approach. Now, multi-layered. These operations spread simultaneously across multiple social media platforms, messaging apps, websites, traditional media, and also official communication channels. These results in an amplification effect, in mutual reinforcement and cross-contamination. And since most of the narrative and the messaging spread is highly polarizing and adapted for emotional reactions, these info campaigns leverage on algorithms and engagement metrics to maximize reach and impact. And this, of course, includes exploiting echo chambers and the viral nature of certain specific content. Again, narratives like the one we mentioned before, the support to Ukraine, migrants issue, green economy, or energy transition. So we said multi-layer and multi-step. Multi-step because at time, certain narratives or message, part of a disinformation operation, might circulate for a brief period of time only to resurface somewhere else in support of other campaigns. Let me give you an example. The original narrative suggesting that Ukraine was selling the weapons obtained from the Western allies to, so to say, not very good countries or autocratic regimes, emerged in the Balkans. And only months later, it emerged in Europe too. When I say Europe, I mean political Europe. By doing so, they're able to build campaigns that are more credible somehow, because they can link to articles and other fake news and other disinformation that already popped up somewhere before. So somehow, like, we have disinformation campaigns that are more coherent. And a good example of that, but I think it's covered in the report, but also I think Margot will talk about this later, is the doppelganger operation. If you Google it, you'll find a lot on this, but again, I think Margot will cover this later. And finally, very important in the context of the coming elections, there are other techniques used for amplifying narratives, which involve the specular use of what we define as useful idiots. Now, I don't like the term useful idiots because I don't remember the last time we convinced somebody to change their mind by calling them an idiot, but let's call them individuals who enjoy a particular media visibility in their own local context. Now, exploiting the visibility of these individuals ensures that the Russian narratives latch onto the news cycles of a targeted country. This is indeed a characteristic element of Russian disinformation strategy, thanks to which operations launched from social media or messaging app often manage to reach a much broader audience. In other words, the strategy hinges on the expectation that some of the narratives will be picked up by these media visible individuals and will become part of the political discourse in a given country. So we also have to be careful not to depict always the Russians as 10 feet tall and spitting balls of fire from their eyes. Sometimes they just know which card to play, and there is somebody that is doing their work for them. This is not the case only in disinformation, but in many, many, many areas of the hybrid threats. Now, if the Russian approach seems more unscrupulous, so to say, the Chinese one reflects the country's strategic culture and is therefore more cautious, less visible, less reactive, but more long-term and programmatic, if you want. Now, the strategic objective of the Chinese is twofold. On the one hand, to exacerbate divisions within individual countries to strengthen China's image and promote Chinese point of view, but also delegitimize democratic systems, propose an alternative to democracy, ultimately damaging the United States and damage or dismantles the US alliance system, therefore weaken transatlantic ties, discrediting NATO by exploiting emerging rifts. And we know that these rifts are indeed emerging, or they could be emerging if there was, for instance, a Trump second term. On the other end, the other strategic objective is to influence and shape policies and political environments in a way that is more favorable to Beijing interests and strategic objectives. Now, all this strategy is put into practice by one thing that is something that the Chinese call themselves media convergence. And it's a term that refers to the integration of the internal and the external propaganda of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is an element of the evolution of the Chinese approach to disinformation, because in the past year, the Chinese propaganda and disinformation was focused on internal issues and the perception of these internal issues abroad. So the Uyghur issues, Hong Kong, Taiwan, which by the way is still perceived as an internal matter. But now is evolving, and is evolving through three aspects: expansion of online and offline channels for the dissemination of propaganda and disinformation, innovation of content and modus operandi, and the intention to impose Beijing standards on global governance of technological infrastructure and digital connectivity. Now, if you allow me, I think I'll take 3 minutes more, but I'll cover the three and then wrap it up. Now, the expansion of online and offline channels. China develops multi-layered operation, as in the case of Russia, but relies on the traditional media of target countries much more. They often enter collaboration agreements, particularly in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, and they use actors in commercial disinformation. China is actively hiring foreign public relation firms in target countries to push their narratives. But the expansion of the narratives also concern networks established by the United Front of Work Department or the Friendship Association of China, or agreements with academic institutions or think tanks. Because there are a lot of think tanks and academic institutions in Europe that don't mind the money. The goal here is plausible deniability. Plausible deniability means we're gonna make them say something that we want to be said, but it's not gonna look like we are saying it, but it's gonna look like it's organic, it's coming from there. The example is Xinhua News Agency. It's the news agency in the world with the largest number of foreign correspondents. 5 years ago, it wasn't like that. The second point, innovation of content and modus operandi. There was a time in which the Chinese institutional organization had to speak with one single voice. I mean, it's the Communist Party, right? Even on propaganda and disinformation. But today, Beijing, it's becoming more opportunistic, and it's able to tailor content to promote narratives in a way that best resonates with the target audience. And they do this by deploying technological tools such as artificial intelligence and big data analytics to probe systematically the public opinions of target countries and create tailored narratives and influence operations that can be much more effective than the Russian ones. There is also another interesting element here, which is what the Chinese themselves call the political native advertising, in which Chinese state-run media organizations purchase space in news outlets abroad to publish state-sanctioned content camouflaged as neutral new articles. In Italy, we had a couple of cases of this. And then the last element of the media convergence. It's the one that is about governance. Now, China wants to ensure that its standards, its norms, and governance protocols in prioritized industry are widely adopted, especially in the global south. The aim is actually to produce an alternative system to the Western one. And to think of an example, you don't have to look that far. Like, you just have to think about Ethiopia. You remember what happened with internet in Ethiopia when there was the war in Tigray, well, actually still going on. They adopted an approach that is very much close to a concept that the Chinese like a lot, which is cyber sovereignty, which is China's vision for internet governance that upholds a government's sovereign right to control the internet within its border, which means in the case of Ethiopia, we go to war with Tigray, we shut the internet off, no information goes out, no information gets in, which is not exactly how we thought of the internet at the beginning of time, if you might remember, at the beginning of its time. Yes, I'm closing. Just to give you an example of what this interest in the governance means. In 2018, within the Belt and Road Initiative, China CloudWalk Technology Company signed a cooperation agreement with the government of Zimbabwe to set up a national recognition a national facial recognition database. In the project agreement, the system is built as being able to help Zimbabwe law enforcement with public safety and security. In turn, though, CloudWalk gained access to biometric data of thousands of African faces, which it will use to enhance the precision of its technology. So I know I've been a bit long with time, and I apologize for that, but I just wanted to close the overview. And well, hopefully I made you all scared.
Thank you very much. That was also it was a fascinating presentation, and I would have a follow-up question, but I'll save it to later in view of the time, because I want to give the floor now to Alice, again, to hear her main takeaway from this report, but also maybe to ask you, I mean, in terms of society, how can we further strengthen societal resilience to this sort of disinformation? I know this is something that you've been working on for a while, along with issues related to the advancement of technologies and how they create polarization.
Thank you for Amanda, and I'm happy to be here today with you. I'm also glad to see so many young people in the audience. I would like to highlight and underscore a line from the report's conclusion, namely that extremist political parties may be able to gain appeal and seats in the European Parliament in an environment marked by disinformation and polarization. And from there, they could further fragment and weaken the future European Union's actions. I think this is really important to underscore. Let me quickly tell you, I don't know if I still am an online influencer. I know that I'm an offline one now, but back in the old days, 2014, I'm speaking of, I was an influencer, and I was one of the early people who already back then was campaigning to become, for the EU to become less dependent on Russian energy. Now, because I was an influencer, apparently the Russian troll factory didn't like that. And they tried to silence me by attacking me online. Well, they picked the wrong person, because instead of becoming silent, I started to educate myself on Russian propaganda, on active measures, on hybrid warfare. And the result was that I founded Defend Democracy. Now, our mission as Defend Democracy is to defend and strengthen democracy against foreign, domestic, and technological threats. These three threats are not separate from each other, but they are interconnected and they are reinforcing each other. Now, in my further contribution, I would like to make 3 points. One is that unless we look at the bigger picture and start connecting the dots between disinformation and narratives, digital technologies and polarization, we are still underestimating their combined threat. Two, what is at stake is not just our democracy, but also our security. And third is that we must invest in building societal resilience. Right, so let's get started. Democracy is teamwork, and that's especially true of the European Union and of the NATO alliance. And they will need to cooperate more closely and also with even more ambition and resources, because the challenges that democracies face are multiple and we must address them urgently. As mentioned, our mission is to defend and strengthen democracy against foreign, domestic, and technological threats. They are interconnected and reinforce each other. So let that sink in. It is crucial that we connect these dots between foreign interference, domestic issues like polarization, extremism, and democratic backsliding, and the negative impact of new and emerging technologies. I often say that democracy is like a marriage. It's not a noun, but a verb. And it's not enough to go vote or organize elections every 4 years. It is something that we must work on every day, like a marriage, to keep it healthy. But like the peace dividend, which means a lack of investment in defense spending because we had peace, we also have a democracy dividend. So for too long, many Western countries have taken democracy for granted, and we didn't invest in it. But democracies are now under attack, and governments have the legal obligation to protect it for their citizens. So we need what the Germans call a Zeitenwende for democracy. And we don't have much time to continue to admire the problem, because we see in plain sight how foreign powers support and exploit domestic populism, polarization, extremism, and erosions of democracy. They work hand in hand, using harmful digital technologies to spread doubt, distrust, and division. And I think if we look at the upcoming European summit taking place tomorrow, we can see this playing out in real time and on a high level. So the future of our democracies and our security depends on building resilience to this interconnected triple threat as of now. And the good news is Defend Democracy has been working on this Zeitenwende for democracy since 2014, even before we officially became an organization. We learned, or we can learn from the Baltics and the Nordics, that we need a so-called whole of society approach to hybrid threats. So Defend Democracy developed a new program called Coalition for Democratic Resilience to help build this democratic resilience as part of an enhanced European security structure. As mentioned, what is at stake is not just our democracy, but our security. That means that the EU, NATO, and their member states must invest in building societal resilience. And let me emphasize, to be very clear, that societal resilience does not equal things like fact-checking, pre-bunking, and media literacy. These are important, of course, but they are drops in an ocean, because the triple threat or hybrid warfare is about so much more than disinformation. Now, recently, NATO allies brought together their senior national resilience officials, and they all agreed the need for enhanced societal resilience and for more effective cooperation between the civilian and military sectors, and also across the governments. Now, since they all agree, which is good, Defend Democracy proposes 2 urgent steps to put our money where our mouth is. One is to make investing in societal resilience part of a country's 2% GDP defense spending. 2, the European Union's multi-annual financial framework must heavily invest in societal resilience. If not, we are not serious about defending our democracies and our security. So let me end my first contribution here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I mean, the 2%, most NATO member states don't still meet that anywhere, so good luck with that. But I have to say that when you were talking about the societal resilience, because I worked extensively on countering radicalization and particularly jihadist extremism, and exactly the same phrase and the same approach was used for that. So I'm wondering if there's any lessons that can actually be taken, because all of that was about societal resilience as well. Whether there's any lessons that actually can be taken and used from all the years that's spent building societal resilience against radicalization in all its forms into this, because I mean it's all about democracy at the end of the day.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, I'm not an expert on extremism, but I imagine there will definitely be lessons to be learned. Yeah. And it's quite, confronting or shocking to realize that our own societies need similar resilience building. And I think that really needs to sink in with our governments and to spend accordingly.
Okay, I'm going to turn to our last speaker now, Margot. I hope you're still with us and you've been very patient. So it would also be great to hear what your main takeaway, but also as was mentioned before, you worked on this doppelganger cooperation. So it'd be good to hear more about that and your views related to it. I'll give you the floor.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me today. And can you see my slide?
Cloud.
Okay, can you see my slide?
We can't see the slide. Okay. Yeah, now we can see it. Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me today. My name is Margot Fulde-Hardy. I'm a researcher and consultant on electoral interference and disinformation. More recently, I used to work at Viginum, the French agency to counter foreign digital interference. And I supported the development of this agency since its inception in 2021. And I was responsible for conducting the French 2022 presidential and parliamentary elections project, where I oversight the monitoring of any potential information attacks during the elections. And so today I'm also carrying a research on the latest 10 years of information operations in electoral context to be able to do comparative analysis of the latest trends cross actors, cross regions. And so I wanted to share with you today what we can expect from next year's upcoming election, the EU parliamentary election, but also the elections in Europe and worldwide. And then how can we best prepare for these upcoming elections? So first, I think, as was highlighted by Federica, there are many disinformation narratives, many tactics happening, and we need to make sense of it. And a way to do it is to think about prioritization. With so many elections coming up next year, we can expect threat actors to prioritize their campaigns. We can think of perhaps the big one, Taiwan, EU election, and US elections, but perhaps we can also think of India or countries in Africa. Why is it important to prioritize? Because it can help us understand, for instance, what narratives will be selected, those who can have a lot of impact, as well as which methods and modus operandi could be developed. So, as Mattia said before, there is a war of attention and there is opportunities for actors to develop their narratives. So to give you an example, there is, for instance, an analysis by a Taiwanese think tank that sheds light on how Taiwanese people self-identify with Israel during the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This self-identification could be leveraged by China as a means to raise fear among the Taiwanese population on the support that the US may or may not provide in the case of an invasion in Taiwan. And this, you see, could be another type of transnational narratives that can be used also in the context of the Ukrainian war. Then on modus and operandi and methods, actors may also not be able to invest as much effort in all elections. And when this is the case, there is one method that we have seen in the past called perception hacking. So for instance, in 2018 and 2022, during the US midterm elections, Russia used perception hacking to spread the idea that they were going to interfere with the election while not investing so many resources as trolls or bots to actually interfere in the elections. Iran has also used that tactics before. Then when we think about the actors, next year, well, we have the usual suspects. So Russia, China, Iran, they all can have a particular reason to interfere. So in terms of narratives, Russia can be interesting in spreading narratives to undermine support to Ukraine or to distract Europeans from the conflict in Ukraine. China could also spread narratives to undermine the support for Taiwan, both from Europe and the US, also to attack the EU-US relationship. Iran information operations are directly linked to its foreign policy. With the ongoing Israeli-Hamas war, undermining the traditional support of supporters of Israel can be a way to achieve its goals. And then we need not to forget about the other actors involved in information operations. So the disinformation for hire. You have social analytic firms, you have influencers, content farm, trolls farm, propaganda mills. And then there is the elephant in the room, which is the domestic audience, the local media and the general audience. So for instance, in the last 2019 EU elections, we saw how far-right European actors amplified Russian narratives and imitated Russian tactics to spread disinformation within Europe. So this needs not to be forgotten. Finally, on tactics and narratives, how could all these actors interfere in next year's election? I'm not going to present an overview of narratives and tactics, but perhaps highlight a few elements. So, as Mattia said also before, the actors pursue objectives or strategies. And in the context of electoral interference, there are three main strategies that can be highlighted. On the long run, polarizing the audience on both sides in the hope that the polarization would spread offline and trigger, for instance, violent movement like the events of the Capitol on January 6th. On the short term, attack or support candidates in the hope that these candidates align with the interest of the actor may win the elections. So we have seen, for instance, in 2021, campaign attacking candidates like Annalena Baerbock in Germany to discredit the candidate. Then the last both short-term and long-term is to to discredit the election process with spreading the narrative of election fraud. And this has been carried on since 2017, spreading from the US to different European elections. So from these three strategies, you can then adjust the main narratives that you foresee that will fit into them depending on the specific context of elections. Regarding tactics, there is a lot of highlights on the role of AI, but here I believe that the still old good tactics, let's say, still work, but flooding the information space. Because the actors, for instance, Russia, the goal is not to convince people, the public opinion of some ideas, it is to sow doubt and confusion. And here, generated AI is not necessarily needed. And then there is one last trend that I would like to underline regarding targeted audiences. And this is linked to what Matthias mentioned, the Doppelganger RN campaign report.
Sorry, can you just repeat what you've just said, because we couldn't hear? I mean, the last few words, yeah.
So the last thing that I want to underline is something that we do not, I think, reflect enough on, is the question of the targeted audience, and namely the trusted sources of information. So as Mattia mentioned, there was since 2022 the Doppelganger RN campaign led by Russia. And in this campaign, the first targeted audience was the media. So you had traditional media that were spoofed, web domains being created to personate those media. And you had La Stampa, La Repubblica, Der Spiegel, Der Welt, Le Parisien, Le Monde. All these traditional mainstream media were targeted. And then you had in March, April, the targeting of government websites. So for instance, in France, you had the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs website that was spoofed. And more recently, from a Microsoft report that was just published, you can see that these targeted audiences have evolved in the form of local influencers. So you have celebrities making videos online, and these videos are being manipulated to spread narratives that are supposedly said by those celebrities. So this shows that current trusted sources of information are being targeted to spread distrust among the general public opinion and continue to polarize the audience. And I think this is really important to think the next step. What can we expect next year? So is it going to be traditional media that would be both target and proxies? Are they going to be local influencers, creators that will be targeting? Is there a new platform that will be used, a new type of trusted sources? This is questions that we need to reflect on. And so how can we best prepare for the disinformation threats? So here I just want to share a few insights based on my perspective as a practitioner. And so in the digital sphere, it is important to elaborate a threat assessment. This threat assessment is the basis to be actually able to identify what will happen next year. It includes information on the context of the election, the legislation in place, information about your local digital practices, because you want to make sure that you know where is your potential targeted audiences, where they interact, where they get their news. Information on the latest strategies, modus operandi of threat actor, based on the latest known cases of election interference. Then all this information can help you identify the window of opportunity. What I call the window of opportunity is this moment in the election where the threat actors know that they can develop a campaign where they will have the most impact. And this is different from one election to the other. If I take the German election of 2021, you have one round, and then you have in the aftermath a series of talks and consultations to design the new coalition. And in that context, it is not necessarily always helpful for a threat actor to influence before the election, but also in the aftermath. And then in France, you have 2 rounds, one debate between the 2 candidates between the 2 rounds. And in the runoff, you have a period of silence for 24 hours before the election day. This means that you have lots of opportunities for a threat actor to actually develop the best impactful campaign. Finally, in the digital sphere, once you have identified, as this report has done, narratives, actors of interest, follow them, and they will lead you to where the information attacks may spread. And to conclude, I would like to first underline what can be done in a whole of society approach in the offline world. So of course, very important to develop cooperation and partnerships to share information across sectors, industry, academics, platforms. You have models such as a design framework that helps this sharing information and helping people to report in a common manner on what they saw. Then it is important to raise awareness about the threat to potential victims like parties, candidates, medias, public opinion, or electoral bodies. And internally, it is important also, whether you work as an academic, NGO, industry, to establish an internal workflow to detect and report in a timely manner. And just to conclude, I just would like to say that what Alice just said on building resilience in society is perhaps the most important thing to do in the long run. Connecting the dots, investing in society resilience, and investing in democracy will be in the long run the most impactful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was also a very comprehensive and informative presentation, so thank you. I now want to open the floor to questions because I know we have only 15 minutes left. If you have a question, can you please raise your hand? We have online and offline. Yes, if you can say who you are and where you're from, that would be very helpful, and who the question's for as well.
Also your email address.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm Riccardo. I'm a research associate at the Alan Turing Institute in London and a postdoc at the Faculty of Economics in Groningen. So I think it's very important to, if you could clarify further whether the paper, or at least from what I've heard, wants to be descriptive or normative, because I think this marks a very huge distinction. Now, let me explain, especially with regards to the intervention by Caniglia. So if it is descriptive, I think most literature would agree. There are a few minor inaccuracies, for example, Hong Kong being domestic or not, but this is another discussion. But if it is descriptive, I think most people would immediately agree. Let's put it that way. If it is normative, it needs to call for something. So it needs to warrant a question, let's say. What should they do differently from what they do, right? Now, by they, I mean, of course, Russia and China in this case. Now, for example, you mentioned Ethiopia shutting down the internet. Well, that's what European and US allies do constantly in those very same scenarios. Think about Egypt during the Arab Spring. Think about Gaza, and what Israel has done there. It's exactly the same. So again, what do you ask them to do if we don't do it ourselves? Technical standardization, the same. For the longest time, and there is excessive literature, we have pushed these countries, particularly China. Russia is much more problematic, but China, for the longest time, has tried to engage more or less constructively in international standardization. And for the longest time, well, kind of yes. And in any case, we should ground it in literature. Yes. So in any case, my main point around this is not to defend or not. It's simply to say, if the paper wants to be normative, I haven't tried it yet, so I don't know. If it wants to be normative, then I believe it's very, very important to ask the question, What are we asking them to do differently when most of the instances you mentioned, including propaganda through media, we have done it and we keep doing it? Think about Israel. I mean, come on, for the longest time. That's my just brief question.
Quickly, yeah. If we think just of the paper, it's more, as I said, a snapshot of what is going on. So it's more descriptive in this way. So trying to collect the most relevant and most common narratives in these three countries, looking at these three topics. So at this point, it's more like raising awareness about what is going on in terms of be prepared ahead of the election. So this is the main goal of the paper itself.
Have any more questions? Yeah, questions here. And I think we have, do we have, yeah, and a gentleman at the back. Maybe we'll take them together.
My name is Linda Winkler. I work at the European Commission in DG Home. It's on. Thank you very much for all the very, very interesting information. I would have many questions, but I'm going to limit myself to two, just to give others also the opportunity. You talk about China and Russia differently in doing disinformation, but I was wondering if you've seen any convergence of campaigns or joint campaigns or similar campaigns. And as a second question, did you see any best practices from national governments or parties, political parties in countering disinformation in maybe in recent elections or in the recent months?
Thank you very much. My name is Ivan, APA at the European Parliament. I work on also this information committee in GIE2 and foreign affairs. Yes, it was very interesting to hear about from all of the speakers. Thank you very much. And especially about the way that Russian interference is very effectively finding existing issues. And we see this quite often. And very effectively, it's quite complex, quite smart in a way, triggering key pain points and putting fuel on the fire in key areas. And that has already been such a big issue in many hotspots in the Balkans, especially, but even on a larger scale with Trump helping get Trump elected, helping Brexit happen. So now it was, yes, Mattia, you did scare me that China is becoming even more proactive and ambitious abroad. So I guess my question is, what is the risk of Chinese and Russian foreign interference converging and working together to some extent? How big is that risk, and how does that change our response? In a way, as Amanda mentioned, it is whack-a-mole. They are constantly coming up everywhere, finding any kind of issue, and we constantly have to be aware and constantly have to address many different ways and topics and formats. Already, even with Russia as a kind of middle power, but China is much bigger. So how big is that threat, and the threat of them working together? And finally, we've seen a bit Russian interference using Chinese hardware because China has better technology and equipment. So that's one thing. But is there a significant risk of China and Russia working closely together, or do they have different agendas in some way? Hopefully, thank you.
No, a very simple question, in a sense, a follow-up to your question. And it's very easy. What actually can be done, both at national level and the European level, beyond the legislative measure that have been quoted in the study, to counter this disinformation campaign? Because I think now it's maybe for the next study, but I don't know, but this is something that we should reflect on. We have a very good analysis of what's happening. We have very little indications of what actually can be done.
Yeah, and so maybe we need to have a transnational approach to this. I mean, a comprehensive strategy. I'm not sure we have one. So I'll give the floor first to you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Now, similarities between China, there are similarities, and there is a lot of piggybacking. So, for instance, we're seeing this a lot in the context of what the recent developments in Israel and Palestine. Of course, the main narrative that is stemming from there is, look at the West, double standards. The West is always the same. Colonizers, we're Russia, we don't colonize, we never did that. Actually, we're helping African countries to get rid of colonization, and China, same narrative. And of course, this is a narrative that they piggyback on each other in different contexts, and not just in the Middle East, but also in Africa and in South America, for that matter. We always forget about South America somehow. So that there is, but this is, I don't think there is. We can talk about some sort of actual coordination. It's more incidental than planned. There are some experts that are talking about a Russification of Chinese disinformation. I think this is totally wrong. It's just something that we can say to the public to make things more understandable, in the sense that what we are seeing is China slowly taking a more adversarial posture in disinformation too. And this started like during the COVID and even before. But yeah, during the COVID, we really started to realize this. I don't know if these answer to the question, but for what we see until now is just this, like piggybacking, narratives in common, point of pressures, but still this happens in areas, in geographical areas where there are common interests. China might as well ignore certain narratives in certain contexts because it doesn't play in their favor. And this is very much something, for instance, linked to the war in Ukraine and certain narratives that Russia has used in Europe that China hasn't touched or hasn't piggybacked on. Best practices from governments, and there is a lot of expertise in Europe, and this is somehow the problem also connected to the last question of the president. There are, as always, there is a strategic disconnect. The strategic disconnect some years ago was the countries of the north and of the north of Europe and the countries in the eastern flank saying the real problem is Russia, and the country in the south will be going, no, the real problem is instability in the Mediterranean and in Africa. And after Russia reinvaded Ukraine, well, the countries in the north and on the eastern flank, they were like, well, you see, we were right. Well, that strategic disconnection is still there. We have countries in Europe that have a lot of sensitivity towards this issue. They have ad hoc agencies, they have modus operandi, they know how to deal with this, they have laws. The Baltics are an example, Sweden is an example. They have a specific agency on the psychological defense. The French are finally trying to match this gap, and I think Margot can speak more about this, but the creation of Viginum, the steps ahead that they're making in coordination between the secret services, Viginum, and other entities that have the responsibility of cyber, because the French, they consider, as it should be, disinformation a part of cyber issues. But there is so much more that we could take from the countries with the best practices and to adopt them in other. And I think the good example here is Italy, which as usual is a bit late, and but it's because there is no political sensitivity. So the work of think tanks is very much needed to make that point, to make politics understand that we need to do something to resolve this issue.
I'll give the floor to you, Margot. So you have your hand up.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes. I just wanted to add to Mattia 2 points on the role of society approach and the models in Europe. One very interesting model that I want to highlight is the Spanish one, because they actually developed since 2018 a very good approach to how link everybody in civil society and also industry and other sectors to think together on ways to counter disinformation. And from this, they have developed several working groups. They have developed a formal approach to countering disinformation, and they continue on raising awareness within society on the different threats evolving. So I think perhaps a duplication of that model at the EU level could be also very interesting to reflect on. And then just to add on China and Russia collusion, there is already evidence of Russia and China collusion on in the narrative field. They are, for instance, amplifying each other, or they are sometimes even using influencers of each other to spread their own narratives. And on the threat that is posed by China, by the PRC, one remaining limit for PRC is one, it's sometimes lack of understanding of the domestic context where it wants to interfere in. So when we talk about the Russification of the tactics, it means that is there a capacity of China to leverage domestic topics or not? Or is it going to continue promote its own narratives, promoting a positive image of China across the world? And then there is a fundamental limit, which is linguistic. There is often a lack of engagement from Chinese content because there is a linguistic limit in the way they develop their narratives. Perhaps generative AI here will be helpful to overcome that. But from now on, I haven't seen a report where there is a real evidence of audience engagement with content spread by China. Thank you.
Thank you. Alice, maybe I can put a question to you actually as a last question. I just want to come back to this all of society approach, but within the framework of youth or younger people, because they're a target audience. Coming back to my experience on CTCVE, schools and teaching was always like a major area where work could be done. I mean, for example, creating handbooks to teach kids or young people about disinformation, sources of disinformation. You think this is something that could also be applied in this context? I mean, obviously in counterterrorism, radicalization, but it could be something that could be applied here. Maybe it's already applied, I don't know.
Well, I think in an increasing number of countries, it is becoming part of the curriculum to teach, let's say, the younger people about media literacy and digital literacy. I'm not sure if it's everywhere a standard part of the curriculum. I think it should be if it's not. But of course, teaching is, a long-term solution. And meanwhile, our democracies are under attack, and our societies are becoming increasingly polarized. So we also need to think of solutions that have a more immediate effect. And I think, so education is more long-term. Content moderation, as you mentioned, is a kind of a whack-a-mole game. So I think we also need to look for other solutions beyond the regulation of platforms, because again, that will take a long time. Some platforms, even with the Digital Services Act, which the highest, the ultimate result could be like a 6% fine, which I'm afraid some platforms may have even kind of calculated in. So we also need to think about other types of regulation, and then I'm looking more at the design end of the digital products that we are using. And one particular or more concrete example is that the European Parliament yesterday has adopted a report in which they call for legislation measures to tackle the addictive design of our online products. And I think that would be a very, very important step forward.
I have to wrap up the meeting because we're at, I'm sorry, at the 1/2 mark, and I want to give Federica the sort of last comments to what you've heard or your main takeaway from this discussion. and whether you have any plans actually to further research in this area going forward.
Thank you, Martyna. First of all, I just want to thank all of you that are here or online for attending this presentation. And what I think it's really important that we are actually talking about that. So we are trying to raise awareness more and more because, of course, there are the elections coming, not just within the European Union, but in several other countries, like we mentioned before. So it's really important to discuss it, but also bring around the table people that have different expertise and can be involved in the discussion from different angles and perspectives, because as we said, we really need a strategy that goes beyond borders, considering also that the threats related to disinformation are not constrained into the borders of countries. So we really need a comprehensive strategy. Steps have been made, as we said before, but I think that it's important to think about it and trying to develop more and more, not just the awareness, but also practical solutions to tackle the risks related to disinformation.
Thank you. And with that, I need to close this panel. Thank you again, all of you, for coming. First of all, thanks to you, Federica, again, for writing this amazing paper. As I mentioned, you can pick it up on when you go outside, or you can find it online. I think we had a very interesting and insightful discussion. Actually, I come away from this a bit scared as well. When I see that things seem to be evolving, not necessarily in the right direction. There's certainly space to do much more to counter this disinformation, and certainly the effort should be speeded up ahead of the European Parliament elections, because we certainly don't want to end up with a bunch of MEPs who are not going to be, let's say, useful for furthering European democracy, fundamental rights and freedoms, if I can put it that way. So once again, thanks to all of you. EPC will continue to work on this topic and many other topics. So have a nice evening to all of you. Thanks for the cooperation. And until the next time, thank you.